The evening of that same day found Miss Marple sitting in Dorothy Sutherland's comfortable parlour, a small room that seemed to embody all the virtues of English domesticity without any of its oppressive stuffiness. Dorothy herself had retired early, claiming a slight headache brought on by the afternoon's social exertions, leaving Miss Marple to her own devices with a book she had no intention of reading and a cup of hot milk she sipped with the regularity of ritual. The garden party had concluded without further incident, yet the minor exchange regarding the locked filling room continued to occupy a corner of Miss Marple's mind with the persistence of a persistent itch one cannot quite reach. She had learned long ago that such small details, dismissed by others as inconsequential, often proved to be the threads from which larger patterns could be unraveled. The village itself seemed to settle into evening with a peculiar restlessness that Miss Marple found noteworthy. Through the open window, she could hear the distant sound of voices from the high street, the public house, she assumed, where the men would gather for their evening pints, and the endless circulation of gossip that formed the lifeblood of village existence. What occupied her thoughts, however, was not the garden party itself, but rather the nature of Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell's anxiety, which had been real and palpable, whatever its source. In her long experience, Miss Marple had observed that there were fundamentally two types of secrets in villages such as this, those that were shameful and those that were dangerous. The former often involved indiscretions, infidelities, or financial mismanagement, the usual catalogue of human weakness. The latter, however, the truly dangerous secrets, were those that threatened not merely reputation, but something more tangible, safety, security, or the delicate balance of power upon which village hierarchies were constructed. At precisely 9 o'clock the following morning, Dorothy brought the post into the breakfast room where Miss Marple had settled with toast and marmalade. Among the usual assortment of letters and circulars was a note addressed in a shaky hand to Miss M. Marple, care of Mrs. D. Sutherland. The envelope bore no return address, which was itself noteworthy. Miss Marple opened it with the calm deliberation she brought to most things, and found a single sentence written in blue ink. "Please meet me in the village churchyard at 3 o'clock this afternoon. There is something you ought to know about Mrs. Hartwell." It was unsigned. Dorothy, who had been discussing the merits of the new baker's bread, fell silent as she observed Miss Marple's expression, which had not changed appreciably, though her hand had stilled for just a moment. "Nothing troubling, I hope?" Dorothy asked, employing the tone of someone who hoped the answer would be no, but suspected it might be yes. Miss Marple folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket. "Merely a request for a meeting," she said, which was true if not entirely forthcoming. She spent the remainder of the morning engaged in the sort of activities that had filled her days for years: correspondence, needlework, and conversation with Dorothy about the village and its inhabitants. Yet her mind was working in that quiet, methodical fashion that had characterized her investigations into human nature since her youth. She was thinking about motive, about who in the village might feel compelled to contact a stranger about Mrs. Hartwell, and about what particular knowledge might be worth the risk of such a communication. The afternoon proved warm and clear, the kind of weather that brought the village out of doors in scattered clusters. Miss Marple made her way to St. Edmund's Church at 5 minutes before 3, moving at her customary unhurried pace, observing as she walked the small details that most people overlooked, the way Mrs. Peterson's curtains moved as she passed, suggesting she was being watched, the fresh repairs to the vicarage gate, the small scratch on the door of Penrose's chemist shop that suggested something had struck it recently, perhaps in haste. The churchyard was peaceful, shaded by old yews that had stood sentinel over generations of graves. Miss Marple found a bench, the same one, she noted, where she had sat the day before while Dorothy pointed out the various monuments, and settled herself to wait. The minutes ticked past with the peculiar slowness that characterized waiting. She observed a blackbird conducting its afternoon business with admirable focus, and she considered the various possibilities that her anonymous correspondent might represent. At precisely 3 o'clock, a figure emerged from behind the church, a young woman whom Miss Marple recognized as Annie, Mrs. Hartwell's housemaid. The same girl who had served the strawberry tarts with such practiced efficiency. Annie looked frightened, her usually composed features twisted with anxiety, and she glanced about nervously before sitting down on the bench at some distance from Miss Marple. "Thank you for coming," Annie said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, though there was no one within earshot. "I couldn't think of who else to trust. You seemed like someone who notices things. The sort of person who understands that what people say isn't always the truth." Miss Marple turned to regard the girl with full attention, her aged eyes remarkably clear and penetrate. I have found that to be frequently true," she said gently. "And what is it precisely that you believe Mrs. Hartwell has not told people?" Annie took a breath, as though preparing herself for a confession, but before she could speak, a sound interrupted them, the sharp crack of breaking glass, followed by a cry that seemed to come from the direction of the village center. Both women started, and Annie's already pale face grew even more ashen. "That's from the High Street," she said, her voice trembling. Miss Marple rose to her feet with the unhurried grace of advancing age, but her expression had sharpened considerably. "Come along," she said. "We had better discover what has happened. The High Street of St. Edmund's Cross, ordinarily a placid thoroughfare lined with the modest shops and establishments that served the village's daily needs, had transformed into a scene of considerable agitation. A crowd had already begun to gather, drawn by the sound of breaking glass and the commotion that followed it. Miss Marple and Annie made their way through the assembled villagers with the quiet persistence of those who had earned the right to be present, and what they discovered was troubling in ways that extended far beyond the immediate chaos. The front window of Penrose's chemist shop had been shattered, a deliberate and thorough destruction that suggested either great force or considerable rage. Glass lay scattered across the pavement and the shop's interior, glinting in the afternoon sunlight, like fragments of some crystalline catastrophe. Inside, visible through the ragged aperture where the window had been, Thomas Penrose himself stood among the wreckage, his face flushed with what appeared to be equal parts anger and distress. Constable Meredith, the village's solitary representative of law enforcement, was attempting to establish order and gather information fro. The chemist, who seemed simultaneously reluctant and desperate to explain what had occurred. Miss Marple observed all of this with her customary attention to detail, noting not merely what was immediately apparent, but the subtle signs that often revealed more than explicit testimony. She noticed, for instance, that Thomas Penrose's hands were trembling slightly as he gestured, that his eyes kept darting toward a specific section of his shop's interior, and that he seemed far more distressed by something other than the mere destruction of his property. "It was vandals," Penrose was saying to the constable, though his voice lacked conviction. "Hooligans from town, no doubt. There's been an increase in such incidents lately, haven't there? The world is becoming increasingly lawless." Constable Meredith, a competent if uninspired man of middle years, nodded with the gravity of someone fulfilling his duty, though Miss Marple could detect the skepticism lurking beneath his official demeanor. Such wholesale destruction of property was unusual in a village like St. Edmund's Cross, and both men seemed aware that the explanation offered was somewhat less than satisfactory. It was at this moment that Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell herself appeared on the high street, having apparently received word of the incident with remarkable speed. Her arrival sent a subtle current through the assembled crowd. People straightened, conversations became more guarded, and there was an almost imperceptible shift in the collective attention. Mrs. Hartwell examined the damaged shop window with an expression that mingled concern with something else entirely, something that Miss Marple found particularly interesting. It was not the expression of someone observing an unfortunate accident or a regrettable act of vandalism, but rather the expression of someone who had anticipated trouble and was evaluating the extent to which her anticipations had been accurate. "This is dreadful," Mrs. Hartwell pronounced, with all the authority of someone accustomed to pronouncements being treated as definitive. "Mr. Penrose, you must file a report with the constable immediately. There is no excuse for such lawlessness. The village must be made safe again." As she spoke, her eyes met Thomas Penrose's for just a fraction of a second longer than was entirely natural, and in that brief exchange, Miss Marple detected something of significance, a communication, subtle but unmistakable, that suggested these two individuals possessed knowledge that they were jointly determined to conceal. Annie, still standing beside Miss Marple, had gone very still, and her hand had found the older woman's arm in a grip that betrayed considerable anxiety. Before any further observations could be made, the crowd's attention was diverted by the arrival of Inspector Graves from the county police, summoned by Constable Meredith through what appeared to have been an expeditious telephone call made from the post office. Inspector Graves was a man of perhaps 50, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and the penetrating gaze of someone who noticed details. He spent approximately 20 minutes examining the broken window, the scattered glass, and the interior of the shop, asking occasional questions in a voice that suggested he found the answers less interesting than the manner in which they were delivered. It was during this examination that Miss Marple became aware of something that most of the assembled villagers had overlooked entirely. The destruction, while apparently random and deliberately destructive, had been curiously selective. The window had been thoroughly broken, yes, but the shelves and displays immediately visible through the aperture appeared largely untouched. More significantly, there was no sign of forced entry to the shop itself, which suggested that whoever had broken the window had done so from the street and had not attempted to access the interior. This was the behavior not of a vandal seeking to steal or destroy systematically, but of someone making a statement, a message as it were, written in broken glass and delivered with a specificity of purpose. Inspector Graves, Miss Marple noted with satisfaction, appeared to be arriving at similar conclusions. He stood back from the shop, hands thrust in his pockets, observing the scene with an expression of mild puzzlement that suggested he recognized the irregularities, but had not yet synthesized them into understanding. As the afternoon light began to slant toward evening and the crowd gradually dispersed, its appetite for drama temporarily satisfied, Miss Marple found herself considering the curious proximity of events. Annie's anonymous letter requesting a meeting, Mrs. Hartwell's anxiety regarding the locked filling room, Thomas Penrose's involvement with some matter connected to lamp oil, and now this deliberate destruction of his shop window. These were not, Miss Marple was increasingly certain, random occurrences. They were linked somehow by threads of motive and consequence that she had yet to fully perceive. That evening, Miss Marple sat in Dorothy Sutherland's parlor once more, though the room seemed to have acquired a different quality in the hours since the broken window had disrupted the village's tranquility. The events of the afternoon weighed upon her consciousness with the persistence of a question that demanded answering, and she had spent the intervening hours engaged in the sort of quiet investigation that had become second nature to her, over decades of observing human nature. She had, quite naturally and without drawing attention to herself, engaged Dorothy in conversatio about the various inhabitants of St. Edmund's Cross and their histories, extracting information with the gentleness of someone merely making pleasant discourse rather than conducting an interrogation. What emerged from these conversations was a picture considerably more complex than the surface appearance of the village suggested. Thomas Penrose, it transpired, had come to St. Edmund's Cross some 15 years prior, purchasing the chemist's shop from the previous owner with what had apparently been a modest inheritance. He had never married, had few close friends, and maintained a rather solitary existence that was notable in a village where community involvement was generally considered a social obligation. More intriguingly, Dorothy mentioned that there had been some scandal involving Penrose perhaps a decade ago, something connected to a young woman from the town, though the details had been tactfully obscured by the passage of time and village discretion. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, by contrast, had been born and raised in St. Edmund's Cross, her family having owned Meadowbrook Hall for 3 generations. She had married the late Reverend Thomas Hartwell in her youth, and they had remained childless until quite late in their marriage, when they had adopted a daughter, Eleanor Jr., who was now married and living in Surrey. Mrs. Hartwell had, upon her husband's death some 8 years previously, taken an increasingly active role in village affairs, establishing herself as a sort of unofficial arbiter of social standards and community propriety. Yet Dorothy's account suggested that this position had not been universally welcomed, that there were those who resented her authority and her tendency to involve herself in matters that were arguably not her concern. When Miss Marple gently inquired about the filled room in Meadowbrook Hall, Dorothy became somewhat evasive, mentioning only that Mrs. Hartwell had always been rather particular about certain areas of her house, and that there was nothing unusual in that, surely, given that one's home was one's private domain. But the hesitation in Dorothy's voice suggested that there was more to the matter than simple domestic privacy. The following morning brought a letter from Annie, delivered by the young housemaid's own hand and received by Miss Marple with careful discretion. In it, Annie had written, with considerable difficulty apparent in the labored script, that she could not meet again without arousing suspicion, but that she felt compelled to provide Miss Marple with certain information that she believed to be of importance. According to Annie's account, she had worked at Meadowbrook Hall for 5 years, and during that time she had become aware that Mrs. Hartwell maintained an elaborate system of keys and locks regarding access to various rooms. Most peculiar was the filling room, which Annie had never been permitted to enter, and from which she had, on several occasions, heard sounds that did not correspond to the storage of ordinary household items. Furthermore, Annie wrote, there had been a significant change in Mrs. Hartwell's behavior approximately 3 months ago. Following a visit from someone Annie did not recognize, a man who had come to the house late in the evening and had closeted himself with Mrs. Hartwell for some hours. From that point forward, Mrs. Hartwell had become increasingly anxious, increasingly concerned with ensuring that the filling room remained locked and secure. Annie had, she confessed, attempted to investigate the matter herself, but had been deterred by both fear and conscience. However, she had observed that on the day of the garden party, just before Christopher Ridley had asked about the filling room, Thomas Penrose had made a visit to Meadowbrook Hall. He had arrived in the late morning and had been shown directly to the filling room by Mrs. Hartwell, with Annie instructed to remain elsewhere in the house. Miss Marple folded the letter with considerable care and deposited it in the small writing desk that Dorothy had placed at her disposal. The pattern was becoming clearer, though many of the details remained obscure. It was evident that Mrs. Hartwell and Thomas Penrose possessed some connection that was being carefully concealed, and that this connection was related to something stored in the locked filling room, something that was sufficiently important or sensitive to warrant elaborate precautions. The broken window at Penrose's shop, Miss Marple now suspected, was not an act of random vandalism, but rather something more calculated and purposeful. It occurred to her that she should very much like to have a private conversation with Christopher Ridley, the young schoolmaster who had inquired about the filling room. There was something about his obvious interest in lamp oil and Victorian engineering that seemed, in retrospect, to carry more weight than mere academic curiosity might warrant. That afternoon, Miss Marple arranged through Dorothy to encounter Christopher at the village library, where he was known to spend his free hours reading and conducting research. The encounter appeared entirely natural and accidental, merely 2 residents of St. Edmund's Cross meeting among the dusty shelves and the smell of aging paper. Christopher Ridley was engaged in examining a large volume on the history of domestic illumination when Miss Marple discovered him, appropriately enough, in a corner of the village library that received afternoon light through tall windows overlooking the churchyard. He looked up as she approached, and his expression suggested the sort of polite wariness that young people often displayed when encountering their elders, a caution born of uncertainty regarding the older generation's intentions and interests. Miss Marple settled herself into a nearby chair with the care that her age now required, and she opened a volume on English cottage gardens that she had selected with deliberate randomness from a nearby shelf. For several minutes, both parties maintained the comfortable silence of library patrons, though Miss Marple's attention was not entirely devoted to the pages before her. She was observing Christopher from the corner of her eye, noting the intensity with which he studied his text, the occasional frown that creased his forehead, and the manner in which his hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. These were not the characteristics of someone engaged in idle historical research. They were the characteristics of someone searching for answers to questions that carried considerable emotional weight. After perhaps 10 minutes had elapsed, Miss Marple closed her book with a gentle sound and turned to address the young man directly, her manner suggesting nothing more than the casual sociability of two people who shared a confined space. "I do hope you're finding the library's collection satisfactory," she said. "It's rather a modest establishment, I'm afraid, though the previous librarian was quite conscientious about acquiring books on specialized subjects." Christopher looked up, and Miss Marple could see in his eyes the struggle between his natural courtesy and whatever preoccupation was claiming his attention. "It's adequate," he replied, with the politeness of someone responding to a social obligation, "though I confess I'm searching for something rather specific. Information about the chemistry and safety considerations of lamp oil in the 19th century. It's proving more difficult to locate than I anticipated." Miss Marple smiled with genuine warmth. "How very interesting. I have always found Victorian engineering to be quite remarkable. The ingenuity with which they solved problems that we now take for granted is truly commendable. Of course, I imagine safety considerations were considerably less rigorous in those days than they are now. People were far less cautious about the dangers inherent in their household arrangements." She paused, allowing her words to settle, and then continued with apparent innocence. "I was speaking with the chemist, Mr. Penrose, just yesterday. Such an unfortunate incident with his shop window, wouldn't you say? And he mentioned that lamp oil storage requires considerable care. Apparently there are certain chemical properties that can become problematic if not properly managed. Have you discussed the matter with him? He seemed to me the sort of man who would possess considerable expertise on such subjects. The effect of this seemingly casual observation was more pronounced than Miss Marple would have anticipated." Christopher's face paled noticeably, and he closed his book with a sharp movement that drew a disapproving glance from Mrs. Harrison, the librarian, who presided over her domain with the stern propriety of someone guarding the temple of knowledge itself. That is to say, I hadn't considered consulting Mr. Penrose," Christopher said, and his voice had acquired a quality of barely controlled anxiety. "Though I suppose that would be the logical course of action." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her aged eyes regarding him with an expression that was kind but penetrating. "You seem troubled, Mr. Ridley, if you'll forgive an old woman's observation. I have found that young people often carry burdens that they feel unable to share with others, particularly in a small village where privacy is something of a luxury. If you find yourself in need of someone discuss difficulties with, not the academic variety, but the more personal sort. I have been told that I am occasionally a useful listener. Discretion has been something of a habit of mine over many years." Christopher stared at her for a long moment, and Miss Marple could see the internal struggle playing across his features, the desire to confide warring with the fear of exposure or judgment. Finally, he rose to his feet, replacing his book on the shelf with careful precision. "I appreciate your kindness, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "But I'm afraid my difficulties are not the sort that can be resolved through conversation. They are—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "They are bound up in matters that would place others at risk should I speak of them." And with that cryptic statement, he excused himself and departed the library, leaving Miss Marple to contemplate the significance of what he had not said more carefully than what he had. That evening, Miss Marple took a solitary walk through the village, ostensibly for the purposes of exercise and enjoying the pleasant weather, though in reality her mind was engaged in the complex work of synthesis and interpretation. She found herself, somewhat by accident that was not entirely accidental, passing Meadowbrook Hall as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The house presented its usual appearance of comfortable respectability, yet Miss Marple paused at the gate and observed it with the focused attention of someone reading a text written in stone and brick. It was then that she noticed something that others might have overlooked: fresh scratches on the lock of the filling room's door, visible through one of the lower windows. They were recent scratches, the kind that would result from someone attempting to manipulate a lock with considerable force or urgency. And just beyond the window, barely visible in the gathering dusk, she could make out the edge of something metallic, a container of some sort perhaps, or a device whose purpose she could not immediately determine. The morning following Miss Marple's observation of the scratched lock at Meadowbrook Hall brought with it a development that transformed the quiet investigation into something considerably more urgent and alarming. Inspector Graves appeared at Dorothy Sutherland's house at approximately 9 o'clock, his expression suggesting that the matter of the broken shop window had evolved into something requiring immediate attention. Dorothy, who had been arranging flowers in the morning room, received him with the carefully composed courtesy of a woman accustomed to dealing with officials, though Miss Marple, observing from her vantage point near the window, could detect the subtle tension in her friend's posture. The inspector was shown into the parlor, where Miss Marple was ostensibly occupied with her correspondence, and he addressed both women with the formal gravity of someone about to impart unwelcome news. "I wonder if you might be aware," he began, settling himself into a chair with the deliberate movements of a man who had long ago concluded that the world operated according to principles he had yet to fully comprehend, "whether either of you has had occasion to observe anything unusual in the village during the past week or so. Matters that might have seemed insignificant at the time, but which could prove relevant to certain inquiries." Dorothy glanced toward Miss Marple with the instinctive appeal of someone seeking guidance, but Miss Marple merely smiled with gentle encouragement and indicated that the inspector should continue with his thoughts. "The matter is delicate," Inspector Graves continued, his fingers steepled in a manner that suggested considerable deliberation. "The D.A. Mage to Mr. Penrose's shop window was, as you may have assumed, not the work of random vandals. A witness has come forward, a young person who prefers to remain unnamed for the present, and has indicated that the window was deliberately broken as a form of intimidation, I suppose one might say. Furthermore, our inquiries into Mr. Penrose's recent activities have revealed certain irregularities that require clarification. It appears that he has been engaged in some form of correspondence with individuals outside the village, individuals whose names do not immediately suggest legitimate purposes." Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction at this confirmation of what she had already begun to suspect, though she maintained her expression of mild interest. "How very troubling," she said. "Mr. Penrose has always seemed to me a man of rather solitary habits, not the sort one would expect to be engaged in elaborate correspondence. Might you share the nature of these irregularities? I confess to a certain curiosity about how the modern police force conducts its investigations." Inspector Graves appeared somewhat taken aback by Miss Marple's directness, but he proceeded to explain that Penrose appeared to have been involved in some form of commercial transaction involving chemical substances. Nothing illegal in itself, you understand, but the nature of the substances and the apparent secrecy with which the transactions had been conducted suggested that there might be matters of concern. He had, moreover, received a substantial sum of money from an unnamed source approximately 3 months prior, a sum that did not correspond to any obvious source of income. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple allowed herself a small observation that was, in fact, the product of considerable deduction. "I wonder," she said thoughtfully, "whether these chemical substances might be related to L.A. MP oil. I make this suggestion not from any particular knowledge, but merely from the observation that Mr. Penrose asked questions at a recent gathering about proper storage procedures for such materials, and that Mrs. Hartwell appeared quite anxious about a locked room in her house that she referred to as the filling room. In a village, you understand, even the smallest details tend to accumulate into patterns when one observes them with sufficient attention." Inspector Graves leaned forward with considerable interest, his eyes sharpening in a manner that suggested Miss Marple had articulated something that had been occupying his own thoughts. "You are remarkably perceptive, Miss Marple. Your observation accords with certain information we have received. Mr. Penrose has, it appears, been conducting experiments related to the composition and volatility of lamp oil, specifically attempting to create a formulation that would be considerably more flammable than standard varieties. The purpose of such an endeavor is, at present, unclear, though the implications are obviously concerning." Dorothy had become quite pale during this exchange, and she reached out to grasp Miss Marple's arm. "Surely this cannot be suggesting that there is some form of danger to the village itself?" she asked. her voice trembling slightly. "That someone might be preparing some sort of catastrophe." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand with reassuring pressure while maintaining her attention on Inspector Graves. "I suspect," she said quietly, "that the situation is more complex than it might initially appear. The broken window, the secret correspondence, the financial transactions. These suggest not a criminal conspiracy in the conventional sense, but rather something more personal. Someone is being coerced, is my hypothesis. Someone is being forced to participate in activities against their WI. LL and the broken window was not merely an act of intimidation, but perhaps a demonstration of the consequences of non-cooperation." Inspector Graves rose to his feet, his expression suggesting that Miss Marple's observations had confirmed suspicions he had begun to form. "I believe you may be correct," he said, "and I believe it is time we had a more direct conversation with both Mr. Penrose and Mrs. Hartwell. There is a matter that requires immediate clarification, and I confess that your observations have provided a context that suggests considerable urgency." He turned to address both women. "I would ask that you remain available for further conversation should it become necessary. There are developments that may occur in the next day or two that will require explanation, and I suspect that Miss Marple, in particular, may find herself called upon to provide testimony regarding her observations." The afternoon following Inspector Graves's departure proved to be one of considerable activity throughout the village, though the nature of this activity was characterized more by rumor and speculation than by any official announcement. Miss Marple learned, through the medium of Mrs. Harrison the librarian, who had it from the postmistress, who had received it from the wife of Constable Meredith, that both Thomas Penrose and Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell had been visited by the inspector and his associate, and that these visits had been conducted with considerable discretion, the officials departing by way of the rear entrances of the respective establishments to avoid drawing undue attention. The village, however, possessed a collective instinct for detecting disturbance that would have done credit to a herd of gazelles observing the distant approach of a predator. By late afternoon, the usual gathering places, the post office, the village shop, and the public house, were buzzing with theories and accusations, each more elaborate and improbable than the last. Miss Marple, maintaining her customary demeanor of interested but not overly engaged observation, gleaned from these conversations certain patterns that suggested the village's collective suspicions were divided along lines that reflected the existing social tensions and allegiances. Some believed Thomas Penrose to be engaged in some form of criminal enterprise. Others whispered that Mrs. Hartwell had become entangled in some sordid affair, and still others suggested that the two were somehow connected in some scheme whose precise nature eluded articulation, but was certainly sinister. It was during the evening of that same day that Christopher Ridley made an appearance at Dorothy Sutherland's house, requesting an audience with Miss Marple with an urgency that suggested something of considerable importance had occurred. Dorothy showed him into the parlor with the discretion of someone long accustomed to protecting her friend's privacy, and the young schoolmaster presented himself before Miss Marple with an expression that combined desperation with a sort of grim determination. "I cannot remain silent any longer," he said without preamble, and Miss Marple gestured for him to sit, observing that this was precisely what she had anticipated he would eventually conclude. "The matter has progressed beyond the point at which discretion serves any useful purpose," Miss Marple said calmly. "I suspect you have information that would be of considerable interest to Inspector Graves. Perhaps you would be so kind as to share it with me first, so that we might determine the most appropriate manner in which to proceed." Christopher took a deep breath and began to speak, and as he did so, the full complexity of the situation began to unfold before Miss Marple like a flower opening to the sun. His account began approximately 18 months previously, when he had first arrived in St. Edmund's Cross to assume his position as schoolmaster. He had, during the course of his early tenure, become acquainted with Mrs. Hartwell's adopted daughter, Eleanor Jr., during one of her visits to the village. They had, he confessed with obvious discomfort, become romantically involved, and their relationship had progressed to the point where they had begun to discuss marriage. Mrs. Hartwell, however, had violently opposed the match, objecting to Christopher's modest social standing and uncertain financial prospects. She had, moreover, threatened to disinherit her daughter should she proceed with the engagement, a threat that had caused considerable distress to Eleanor Jr., who had always been given to understand that Meadowbrook Hall and its considerable assets would eventually come to her. The situation had reached a crisis point approximately 3 months ago, when Mrs. Hartwell had made a discovery that had, Christopher believed, materially altered the course of events. He himself did not fully understand the nature of this discovery, but he believed it was connected to certain financial irregularities in Mrs. Hartwell's management of her late husband's estate. Thomas Penrose, it appeared, had either discovered these irregularities or had acquired knowledge of them through some other means, and had used this information as leverage to compel Mrs. Hartwell to provide him with certain materials and assistance in conducting his chemical experiments. The broken window, Christopher explained, had been orchestrated as a demonstration of Penrose's willingness to escalate his tactics should Mrs. Hartwell prove reluctant to continue her cooperation. What made the situation particularly urgent, Christopher continued, was that he had become aware, through Eleanor Jr.'s correspondence, that Penrose's experiments were not merely academic in nature, but were aimed at producing a substance of considerable danger, something that could potentially be used as an incendiary device. Furthermore, Eleanor Jr. had hinted, with considerable anxiety, that Penrose had made references to employing the substance in some manner that would result in significant property damage that would be blamed upon someone else, thereby providing cover for his own activities. Miss Marple listened to this account with her customary attentiveness, occasionally interjecting a question designed to clarify certain points or to probe for details that Christopher had left implicit rather than explicit. When he had finished, she sat back in her chair and contemplated him with an expression of grave thoughtfulness. "You have done the correct thing in coming to me," she said finally, "though I confess that the situation is considerably more complex than even my preliminary observations had suggested. It appears that we are dealing not merely with a matter of blackmail and coercion, but with a situation in which multiple parties are acting upon different understandings of the truth, and in which the convergence of these misunderstandings threatens to produce a catastrophe of considerable proportions." She rose to her feet with deliberate care. "We must contact Inspector Graves immediately. The information you have provided is of crucial importance, and there are certain interpretations of events that require his official consideration. However, before we do so, I must ask you one additional question. To your knowledge, has Mr. Penrose made any explicit threats regarding the timing or the target of his intended use of this incendiary substance?" Christopher's face went very white. "Yes," he said quietly. "According to what Eleanor Jr. conveyed to me, he has suggested that the destruction would occur at Meadowbrook Hall itself, during some sort of gathering. He intends, I believe, to stage an accident that will result in the hall being destroyed by fire." The telephone call to Inspector Graves was conducted by Miss Marple herself, employing a tone of such calm authority that the operator at the exchange seemed to defer to her without question, connecting her directly to the inspector's temporary headquarters at the village police station. What transpired in that conversation was brief but consequential. Within the space of 20 minutes, Inspector Graves and 2 constables arrived at Dorothy Sutherland's house, and Christopher Ridley's account was recorded in meticulous detail for official purposes. The inspector's expression throughout this recitation suggested that certain pieces of a puzzle he had been attempting to assemble were finally falling into their proper positions. "This changes matters considerably," he said, once Christopher had completed his testimony. "We have been operating under the assumption that this affair was primarily concerned with blackmail and financial irregularities. The revelation that Mr. Penrose intends to commit arson and potentially to endanger lives elevates the matter to something considerably more serious." He turned to address Miss Marple directly. "I wonder whether your observations might have extended to identifying the precise nature of Mrs. Hartwell's financial indiscretions. If we are to prevent Mr. Penrose from acting upon his intentions, we need to understand the full scope of his leverage over her." Miss Marple settled herself in her chair with the careful deliberation of someone about to articulate conclusions that had been forming themselves gradually over several days of observation and reflection. "I believe," she said, "that Mrs. Hartwell has, over a period of years, been systematically misappropriating funds from her late husband's estate. The amounts were likely modest enough that they would not immediately draw attention from external auditors, but sufficiently substantial over time to constitute a considerable sum. My hypothesis, based upon various small observations, is that she has been using these funds to support her adopted daughter's lifestyle in London, providing her with an allowance considerably larger than what her actual circumstances would warrant. When Mr. Penrose discovered this, and I suspect he may have done so through some connection to the family's financial affairs, R.S., given his role as chemist and perhaps his involvement with certain professional matters, he recognized the opportunity to leverage this knowledge to compel her cooperation in his experiments. Christopher interjected quietly that Eleanor Jr. had mentioned in her letters that her mother had always seemed anxious about money despite their apparently comfortable circumstances, and that there had been hints of tension regarding her allowance and her spending habits. Inspector Graves rose to his feet, and his movements suggested a man suddenly animated by the necessity of action. "We must locate Mr. Penrose immediately," he said. "If his intention is to stage this incident at Meadowbrook Hall, we need to determine whether he has already positioned his materials and whether he has set any timeline for his intended action." He dispatched one constable to secure the chemist's shop and residence, and instructed the other to inform Constable Meredith to keep watch on Meadowbrook Hall. Before departing, he turned to address Miss Marple once more. "I wonder whether you might be willing to remain available for further consultation. Your observations have proven invaluable, and I suspect that before this matter is fully resolved, your insights may prove crucial." Miss Marple inclined her head gracefully. "I shall be available," she said, "though I confess that there remain certain aspects of this situation that do not yet align themselves into a coherent pattern. Mr. Penrose's motivation, for instance, seems to extend beyond the mere exercise of power through blackmail. There is something personal in his intentions, something that suggests a more profound grievance." After the inspector and Christopher had departed, leaving Miss Marple and Dorothy to contemplate the events that had transpired, the older woman found herself drawn into a contemplative silence that lasted well into the evening. The following morning brought news that sent a fresh shock through the village. Thomas Penrose had disappeared. His residence had been found with signs of hasty departure, drawers left open, certain articles of clothing and personal items removed, and, most significantly, the back door left unlocked in a manner suggesting urgent evacuation rather than deliberate closing. The inspector's theory was that Penrose, becoming aware through some means that his plans were in danger of exposure, had fled the area to avoid apprehension. Search parties were organized, and the surrounding roads and railway stations were alerted to watch for a man matching Penrose's description. Yet Miss Marple, sitting in Dorothy's parlor and reviewing the sequence of events in her mind, found herself unconvinced by this straightforward narrative. There was something about Penrose's character, as she understood it from her observations, that suggested a man driven by obsession rather than mere self-preservation, a person engaged in elaborate schemes of blackmail and intended arson. She reasoned, would not abandon such plans at the first hint of detection. They would rather accelerate them or seek to ensure their completion before the opportunity was lost. That afternoon, a messenger arrived at Dorothy's house with an urgent summons for Miss Marple to attend Inspector Graves at Meadowbrook Hall. The summons was cryptic in its wording, but its tone suggested that developments of significance had occurred. As Miss Marple prepared to make the journey, she found herself reviewing one particular detail that had troubled her throughout her investigation, a detail so small that many would have dismissed it entirely, yet which now seemed to her to contain within it the key to understanding the true nature of the catastrophe that had been unfolding beneath the village's placid surface. Meadowbrook Hall presented an appearance of considerable agitation when Miss Marple arrived, with Inspector Graves and several constables engaged in what appeared to be a systematic examination of the premises. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell herself was seated in her drawing-room, her composure somewhat diminished from its usual formidable state, though she maintained a rigid posture that suggested she was determined not to surrender entirely to whatever distress she might be experiencing. Inspector Graves greeted Miss Marple with evident relief and proceeded to explain the reason for the summons. The locked filling room, it had transpired, contained not merely supplies of lamp oil and related materials, but also certain documents and financial records that corroborated Miss Marple's hypothesis regarding Mrs. Hartwell's misappropriation of estate funds. More significantly, however, the room contained evidence of Thomas Penrose's experiments, apparatus for distilling and testing various chemical formulations, along with several containers of a volatile substance that the inspector's preliminary assessment suggested was precisely the incendiary material that Christopher Ridley had described. Yet what had prompted the urgent summons was not the discovery of these materials, but rather a letter that had been found among Mrs. Hartwell's personal effects, a letter that appeared to have been composed by Penrose himself, and which, when read in its entirety, suggested a narrative considerably more complex than the one that had thus far been constructed. "I wonder if you would read this," Inspector Graves said, handing Miss Marple the letter with considerable care, "and provide your assessment of its significance. Your understanding of human motivation has proven remarkably accurate, and I confess that this document presents certain puzzles that require interpretation." Miss Marple accepted the letter and settled herself to read it with the deliberate attention she brought to all matters of importance. The letter was dated approximately 1 month prior, and was addressed to Mrs. Hartwell in formal, almost stilted language that suggested considerable emotional constraint. In it, Penrose recounted a history that Miss Marple had not previously fully understood. He wrote of a young woman whom he had loved deeply approximately 20 years prior, a woman who had been employed as a governess at Meadowbrook Hall. This woman, whose name had been Catherine Wells, had borne him a child, a daughter, out of wedlock, a circumstance that had resulted in her dismissal from Mrs. Hartwell's employ and her subsequent disappearance from the village. Penrose had attempted to locate her over the years, but his efforts had been unsuccessful until recently, when he had discovered, through the intervention of a private investigator, that Catherine Wells had died in poverty and obscurity in London some 10 years previously. Her death hastened, he believed, by the shame and hardship resulting from her situation. The letter continued with Penrose's account of his discovery, through careful investigation, that Mrs. Hartwell had not merely dismissed Catherine Wells, but had actively ensured that the young woman would find no employment elsewhere, had spread rumors regarding her character, and had, through her social influence, rendered Catherine completely unemployable and therefore desperate. This revelation, combined with the subsequent discovery of Mrs. Hartwell's financial irregularities that had, Penrose claimed, been used to fund a lifestyle of considerable luxury for her adopted daughter, while the legitimate needs of the village went unattended, had crystallized in his mind as evidence of a profound moral corruption that demanded response. However, the nature of the response that Penrose proposed was not, as had been assumed, the destruction of Meadowbrook Hall through incendiary means. Rather, he wrote, his intention had been to stage a fire that would be discovered to be the result of Mrs. Hartwell's own negligence in storing highly flammable materials, thereby publicly exposing not merely her physical carelessness, but also, through the investigation that would necessarily follow, the financial crimes that the fire's investigation would uncover. Miss Marple lowered the letter and regarded Inspector Graves with an expression of grave thoughtfulness. "This letter," she said, "suggests that Mr. Penrose's intention was not to commit murder or to endanger lives, but rather to orchestrate a situation in which Mrs. Hartwell's crimes would be exposed. It is, in a sense, a form of justice, albeit one that operates outside the framework of law and propriety." She turned her attention to Mrs. Hartwell, who had been listening to this analysis with evident distress. "I wonder whether you might provide your account of the matter. There are certain aspects of this situation that still require clarification, and I believe that your perspective might prove illuminating." Mrs. Hartwell, after a long moment of silence, began to speak in a voice that was barely above a whisper. She confirmed, with evident reluctance, the accuracy of Penrose's account regarding Catherine Wells, though she attempted to justify her actions by claiming that she had merely been protecting the moral standards of her household and the reputation of her family. She acknowledged, moreover, that Penrose had approached her with his scheme some 3 months prior, threatening to expose both her historical cruelty and her financial crimes unless she provided him with access to her property and assistance in conducting his experiments. But where is Mr. Penrose now? Miss Marple, he asked, and her question seemed to strike at the heart of the matter that remained unresolved. Inspector Graves exchanged a glance with one of the constables, and then turned to address Miss Marple with an expression suggesting that the answer to her question was both obvious and deeply troubling. "We discovered him this morning," the inspector said quietly, "in the filling room itself. He appears to have inadvertently ignited one of his chemical preparations during the night. The fire was contained to that single room, and we extinguished it before it could spread. But Mr. Penrose was overcome by smoke inhalation before he could escape. The revelation of Thomas Penrose's death seemed to settle over Meadowbrook Hall like a fog, transforming the house from a location of mystery into something altogether more somber, a place where fate appeared to have rendered its own verdict upon the tangled affairs of mortal ambition and grievance." Miss Marple remained seated, the letter still held loosely in her hands, and her expression suggested that she was processing not merely the fact of Penrose's death, but the manner in which it had occurred and what such a manner might signify. Inspector Graves, observing her careful consideration, seemed to recognize that she possessed insights that extended beyond the immediate facts that had been presented, and he waited with the patience of someone who had learned that Miss Marple's silences often preceded observations of considerable importance. "The circumstances of his death," Miss Marple said finally, "require careful examination. You have indicated that the fire was discovered this morning and that Mr. Penrose was found in the filling room itself, overcome by smoke inhalation. Yet I wonder whether the sequence of events might not be somewhat different from what appears on the surface. Tell me, Inspector, what was the precise state of the filling room when it was first examined? Was there evidence suggesting that Mr. Penrose had been attempting to extinguish the fire, or was his position in the room suggestive of something else entirely?" Inspector Graves consulted with one of the constables who had participated in the investigation, and the information provided seemed to cause him to pause and reconsider certain aspects of his preliminary conclusions. "The position in which Mr. Penrose was found," the constable reported, "was seated in a chair, as though he had been deliberately waiting or observing something. There were no signs of struggle or panic, no indication that he had attempted to flee or to extinguish the flames. It was almost as though—" The constable trailed off, uncertain how to articulate what the physical evidence seemed to suggest. Miss Marple nodded slowly, as though this information confirmed something that she had suspected. "I believe," she said, addressing both Inspector Graves and Mrs. Hartwell, "that we are dealing with a situation considerably more deliberate and purposeful than an accidental ignition of chemical materials. Mr. Penrose, it appears, had orchestrated not merely the exposure of Mrs. Hartwell's crimes, but also his own death, a death staged to appear accidental, but which was in fact a deliberately chosen conclusion to his narrative of justice and vengeance." She turned her attention directly to Mrs. Hartwell. "What I find most troubling, however, is not Mr. Penrose's actions, which were motivated by genuine and profound grievance, but rather what might occur should the true circumstances of his death become known to the village. The discovery that he deliberately ended his life, combined with the exposure of your financial crimes, would create a situation in which the village itself would become complicit in a form of judgment that operates outside the bounds of law and morality." Mrs. Hartwell's face had become very pale, and her hands trembled as she attempted to maintain her composure. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Miss Marple rose to her feet and moved to the window, from which she could observe the village spread out below, the houses and streets and gardens that formed the physical manifestation of the community's collective life. "I am suggesting," she said, "that there is a critical decision to be made regarding what narrative will be presented to the world regarding these events. The legal facts are clear. Mr. Penrose engaged in blackmail and conspiracy, and his death, whether accidental or deliberately chosen, does not alter the nature of his actions. However, the human facts, the story of Catherine Wells, of her suffering and early death, of the cruelty that contributed to her fate, these facts demand consideration as well." I'm suggesting that Inspector Graves must determine whether the evidence regarding Mr. Penrose's deliberate choice to end his life should be made public, or whether it should remain a matter known only to those directly involved in the investigation. Inspector Graves appeared to struggle with the implications of what Miss Marple was proposing. "You are asking me to conceal evidence," he said, "not as an accusation but as a statement of fact, to alter the official record in order to protect Mrs. Hartwell from the full consequences of judgment." Miss Marple turned from the window to regard him directly. "I am suggesting," she said, "that justice is a concept considerably more complex than the law often allows for. Mr. Penrose has received what might be called his justice. The exposure of Mrs. Hartwell's crimes will necessarily follow from the investigation into the fire, and her criminal liability will be established through the discovery of the documents and financial records. The village will know what she has done. What they need not know is precisely how she came to be held accountable for those actions. The narrative of accidental death, while factually inaccurate, is not materially different in its consequences from the narrative of deliberate sacrifice." She paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. "However, the decision regarding what to do with the evidence regarding Mr. Penrose's deliberate choice must rest with you, Inspector. I am merely an observer of human nature, not an arbiter of official truth." The silence that followed this exchange was profound and extended. Inspector Graves stood motionless, the weight of decision visible in his expression, while Mrs. Hartwell sat with her head bowed, awaiting whatever judgment would be rendered. Miss Marple, having articulated her position, seemed content to allow events to proceed according to their own logic. After several minutes had elapsed, Inspector Graves spoke, his voice steady though carrying the weight of reluctant choice. "The official report will indicate that Mr. Penrose's death resulted from accidental ignition of his chemical preparations. The documents regarding his deliberate actions will be sealed and will not form part of the public record. However," he continued, addressing Mrs. Hartwell directly, "you will be formally charged with financial crimes, and you will face prosecution to the full extent of the law. Your crimes against Catherine Wells are beyond the reach of legal remedy, but your financial crimes are not, and justice, however incomplete, will be pursued." The weeks that followed the discovery in the filling room at Meadowbrook Hall witnessed a transformation in the social and emotional landscape of St. Edmund's Cross that was as profound as it was inevitable. The official narrative, as disseminated through the careful management of Inspector Graves and the circumscribed reporting of the local press, presented the incident as a tragic accident, a chemist engaged in amateur experimentation with flammable substances, a careless moment, an unfortunate death. The village, for the most part, accepted this version of events with the general readiness of communities everywhere to embrace explanations that required minimal disruption to their understanding of the world. However, the financial crimes of Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell could not be similarly obscured or explained away, and the investigation into her misappropriation of estate funds proceeded with inexorable progress toward legal consequences. By autumn, formal charges had been filed, and it became apparent that Mrs. Hartwell would face prosecution before the magistrate's court, with the likelihood of significant penalties and possible imprisonment looming before her. The village gossip, naturally, continued unabated, but it had acquired a different quality, less the excited speculation of mystery, and more the grim satisfaction of judgment rendered upon one who had long occupied a position of unchallenged authority. Christopher Ridley had, through his cooperation with the investigation and his courage in providing testimony regarding Eleanor Jr.'s communications, established himself as a figure of some moral standing in the village consciousness, and his prospects had improved considerably as a result. Eleanor Hartwell, the adopted daughter, had returned from London following her mother's arrest, and she and Christopher had quietly announced their engagement, an announcement that met with general approval from the village, which seemed eager to embrace a narrative of young love and redemption in the aftermath of scandal. Annie, Mrs. Hartwell's housemaid, had secured new employment with a respectable family in the neighboring market town, A. She had, in her own quiet way, achieved a modest independence that would have been denied to her had she remained in Mrs. Hartwell's service. The chemist's shop remained closed, its window still bearing the marks of the vandalism that had precipitated so much of the subsequent drama, and there seemed to be a tacit agreement among the villagers that the premises should be allowed to stand as a sort of memorial to the man who had occupied it and whose grievances, however misguided his methods, had pointed toward truths that the village had preferred to ignore. It was on a cold afternoon in late October that Miss Marple found herself walking through the churchyard, a habit she had developed during her stay in St. Edmund's Cross, a practice of solitary reflection that seemed to suit both her temperament and her advancing years. The graves around her testified to the continuity of human life and death, to the endless cycle of generation and loss that characterized existence in a small village. She had paused before the grave of Catherine Wells, a simple stone, recently erected by means of funds provided anonymously, though Miss Marple harbored no doubt regarding the source of that anonymous generosity, when Dorothy Sutherland found her there. Dorothy had come to inform her that she had received a letter from Inspector Graves, a letter that conveyed certain information regarding the sealed documents that had been placed beyond public scrutiny. The inspector had written that he believed Miss Marple deserved to know the full contents of Thomas Penrose's final communication, a letter addressed to no one in particular, but which seemed clearly intended for the eyes of those who would understand its significance. The letter, Inspector Graves had indicated, would be forwarded to Miss Marple, though it carried with it the explicit understanding that its contents were never to be revealed to the public or to the village at large. That evening, in the privacy of Dorothy's parlor, Miss Marple read Penrose's final letter, and as she did so, she found herself moved by emotions that she had learned over many decades to regard with a certain detached understanding. The letter was brief, written in a hand that grew increasingly unsteady as it progressed, and it contained Penrose's explanation of his intended sacrifice. He wrote of Catherine Wells with a tenderness that suggested the depth of his feelings had never diminished with the passage of years, and he explained that he had come to believe that justice, true justice, could only be achieved through his own obliteration, through the removal of himself from the world as a form of restitution for the suffering that his helplessness had permitted. He had not, he wrote, intended to harm Mrs. Hartwell directly, but rather to create the circumstances by which her crimes would be exposed, and her authority over the village would be diminished. His own death was not, he emphasized, an act of despair but an act of intention, a final statement regarding the value he placed upon the memory of Catherine Wells and the need for her suffering to be acknowledged and in some measure avenged. Miss Marple folded the letter with careful precision and sat in silence for a long time, contemplating the complex interplay of motive and consequence that had shaped the events of the past weeks. She reflected upon the nature of justice and morality, upon the ways in which human beings construct narratives to explain the inexplicable, and upon the profound loneliness that seemed to characterize the human condition regardless of one's position in society. When she finally spoke, it was to Dorothy, who had been waiting with the patience of long friendship for whatever conclusions Miss Marple might articulate. "I have learned," she said slowly, "that villages are much like gardens. They appear on the surface to be orderly and well-maintained, places where things proceed according to established patterns and principles. Yet beneath the surface there exist complex systems of growth and decay, of flourishing and withering, that operate according to laws that are not always apparent to the casual observer. The events that have transpired here in St. Edmund's Cross are, in a sense, merely the visible manifestations of processes that have been operating invisibly for many years. Justice, when it finally arrives, often seems to appear suddenly, as though some catastrophic event has revealed truths that were always present but hidden from sight. Yet in reality, these truths have been accumulating, layer upon layer, until the weight of them becomes too great to bear, and the structure that had concealed them collapses beneath the burden of their reality. Dorothy reached out and took her friend's hand, understanding that what Miss Marple was articulating was not merely an observation about the specific events of the village, but a meditation upon the nature of human existence itself, the eternal struggle between appearance and reality that characterized life in all communities, large and small.